In the world of Hunter x Hunter, a Hatsu, or ability, is one's own personal expression of Nen. This is especially the case when it comes to specialists, as their Hatsus tend to be deeply entwined with the user's character, almost acting as a direct manifestation of their personality, their desires, or things that fundamentally shaped them. This to such an extent that some specialists, like Neon, manifest their abilities from a young age without any Nen training whatsoever. This deep connection is also the reason why specialists tend to apparently have only one ability, though it usually tends to be multi-layered and with many different facets to it. Much like the individuals themselves, who tend to be exceptional in many ways, specialization itself is peculiar. My goal with this video is to show you how strange it actually is, point out some inconsistencies regarding it, and give my own rationale as to how these things can be made to fit together in a coherent manner, where possible. First and foremost, let's make sure we're all on the same page. The 6 categories devised by Togashi which make up the Nen diagram are, of course, enhancement, transmutation, conjuration, specialization, manipulation, and emission. Additionally, their positions aren't random and are there to showcase the affinity a user of one particular category would have towards all others. For example, an enhancer would have a 100% affinity towards enhancement, as you might imagine. Around 80% affinity for emission and transmutation, depending on which type they lean toward. Gon, for example, leaned more towards emission. Around 60% for conjuration and manipulation, and 0 in specialization. Mind you, this is not because specialization is opposite to enhancement, but because none of the 5 regular types really have any affinity for specialization whatsoever. For instance, this is how a transmuter's affinity distribution would look like. Now, when we were first introduced to the 6 types of Nen, Izunavi told Kurapika that the reason specialization was placed between conjuration and manipulation was a bit arbitrary, since it doesn't really behave like any of the other 5 types, and was placed between those two simply because the people belonging to those 2 categories tended to become specialists later on in life more frequently. This is why the users of both categories are set as having a 1% affinity for it, more as a symbolic gesture than an indication of actual affinity. However, despite its placement being mostly seemingly arbitrary, specialization, as we have seen, nonetheless regularly affects the affinity distribution of all the other categories. This is an inconsistency. If specialization was indeed as said by Izunavi, the diagram would look more like this, or maybe even this. It wouldn't affect the affinity distribution of the other categories, but could still be adjacent to the 2 types that seem to more often shift into it. The fact that specialization is placed within the diagram, along with the other regular types, doesn't make much sense, even more so considering some of the points I'll be going over in a moment. You see, specialization is somewhat of a catch-all category, in the sense that all abilities which do not fit the boundaries of the other 5 established categories find their place within it. Hatsus like Pakunoda's mind-reading ability or Neon's fortune-telling, for example. Among this very wide range of potential abilities, I believe there to be one broad subcategory of abilities that really muddy the waters regarding specialization. That being the subcategory of abilities which acquisition the abilities of others. Hatsus like Krol's Bandit Secret, Leol's Rental Pod, and potentially Merum's Aura Synthesis as well. These among a few others, but that would require manga spoilers. I want to be sure to note that normal specialist abilities pose no inherent issue. The subcategory of abilities like Bandit Secret is where things get dicey. The fact that specialists that can appropriate the abilities of others not only exist, but can even be categorized as a subset of specialists due to how frequent they are, in comparison to the total number of specialists known, entails that this is absolutely a valid ability type. This is also where the second issue arises. We simply do not know the affinity distribution for specialists when it comes to their maximum proficiency in other Nen categories. I initially took it for granted that the standard distribution applied to specialization like it did to all the other categories, and didn't think much of it. It was placed within the diagram for a reason after all. Going by this, you would expect specialization to have 80% affinity for the adjacent conjuration and manipulation, 60% for emission and transmutation, and 40% in the opposite category of enhancement. I no longer believe this to be the case. There are three main reasons why. First, specialists who acquisition the abilities of others seem to use them to the same level of power as the original users once did. There has never been any outright indication that any of the acquisitioned abilities are any less potent simply because they do not fall within the specialist category. Furthermore, if their potency was decreased due to the affinity distribution and not any limitation set by the user themselves to make their ability more optimal in some other regard, this kind of specialist ability would most likely neither be as widespread nor formidable. It is after all much more prudent to have an ability of your own that you can reliably utilize to its fullest extent, instead of relying on the scuffed abilities of others. Especially since acquiring, maintaining, and using them usually already requires fulfilling a bunch of conditions and could entail additional vows and limitations in order to be optimized. Second, if specialization indeed abided by the regular affinity distribution, you'd expect specialists to be rather fragile. It was mentioned on multiple occasions that enhancement is an absolute must in combat, especially in outright brawls, as without it even a single nan-enhanced punch or kick could prove deadly. How do we know though that this is indeed not the case with specialists? Kroll's battle versus the Zoldycks. During that fight, Kroll took multiple hits from two top-class transmuters, and managed to shake them off for the most part. This while a conjurer like Kurapika, who has a 60% affinity for enhancement, and maxed out potency due to his scarlet eyes, got his arm completely shattered after a single punch from Uvogin. I'm aware that Uvogin was an enhancer while Zeno and Silva are both transmuters, but I want you to take into consideration the vast difference in A. the affinity for enhancement of transmuters when compared to specialists. The Zoldycks would have double the affinity for it when compared to Krollo if the standard distribution were applied. And B. the massive physical difference between Krollo and Silva. Krollo ranks 7th in arm wrestling among the 13 Phantom Trope members we initially met, and that is actually impressive. But considering Silva's build, skills, and the fact that he can definitely open the 7th testing gate, weighing at 256 tons, I can't imagine how a simple nan-empowered strike from him wouldn't deal the same amount of damage as Uvogin did to Kurapika. At least. I am, by the way, basing this on the fact that Killua during the election arc could open the 5th gate weighing at 64 tons, and he's barely like 14 at that point. Third, it was stated that specialists aren't at a real disadvantage if their category is revealed, due to their incredibly wide range of abilities, and, I believe, general vagueness as a category. Bear in mind, if it were true that specialists had only a 40% affinity for enhancement, this information would make knowing their Nen category really valuable. Perhaps not as much as knowing any of the other 5, but you'd at least have one definitive weak point you could make a strategy around. And that would definitely qualify as a substantial disadvantage in my book. With this, we can deduce that regular distribution does not apply to specialization. Alright, how does then specialization work in this regard? I've come up with two possibilities. Number 1. Specialists are completely abnormal and the affinity distribution as we know it simply cannot be applied to them. Now this kind of goes with my notion that specialization should be viewed as pretty much its own thing, outside of the 5 regular categories. This would also entail that any ability someone like Krollo acquires simply becomes a specialist ability while it is in his possession, which further entails that specialization isn't simply that which does not fit into the other 5 types, but can essentially emulate their properties. A system in its own right, essentially independent of the diagram as we know it. I must say, though, I don't particularly like this, nor do I believe this to be Togashi's style or intent. Having come up with a system as deep and complex as Nen, only to have a category like specialization that almost completely bypasses it, is not something I personally get the feeling he'd be happy with, especially since he did conceptualize it as being a part of the system proper, as the diagram shows. Number 2. If specialist abilities effectively choose the user rather than the user choosing the ability, it could be argued that each specialist has their own individual and atypical affinity distribution, which makes possible the realization of their particular Hatsu. For example, While a Hatsu like Neon's would completely fall within the realm of specialization, a Hatsu like Pakunoda's would mean she has a strong affinity for conjuration and or emission, depending on whether the gun is conjured or real, and whether the memory bombs it fires are conjured or emitted. Probably the former though, if I had to guess. Additionally, considering she doesn't have a particularly combative personality and likes to keep to long-range attacks, this could tell us that enhancement probably isn't her strong suit. Furthermore, this would mean that all specialists whose abilities are based on acquisitioning other Hatsus would have a very high, if not total, affinity for most or all of the other Nen types. The only way this is balanced, so as to not make them borderline gods, is by the fact that specialists, for the most part, already come with an inbuilt Hatsu, and the fact that certain principles of how Nen operates keep them at bay. There seems to exist an internal balancing principle which transcends Nen typology and which is responsible for determining the potential power and quality of particular abilities, much like the power systems of many RPGs, for example. We could see this through the fact that various really powerful abilities throughout the show needed specific conditions, vows, and limitations to be set/met in order for them to be effective, or even possible. Acquiring and taking away another's Hatsu is a borderline hacker-level feat, so it seems reasonable that the investment of skill points, let's say, needed in order to create or manifest such an ability would be rather steep. In conclusion, specialization is much more complicated than first impressions would have us believe. It normally affects the affinity distribution of the other 5 categories, despite its seeming arbitrariness, and its own affinity distribution with regards to those categories is unknown. However, it is my belief, considering what we've had the chance to see thus far, that specialists are either completely outside the regular system, and all of their abilities, even those that emulate the properties of other regular categories, essentially fall within specialization, which would make Pito's puppeteering or even the simple conjuring of Crowl's book fully specialist abilities. Or that specialists aren't so special that they're actually outside the system, but instead come pre-wired with those affinities which make possible the realization of their particular Hatsus. It's been a while since I did a post-topic ramble. There are 2 things I want to quickly mention here. First and foremost, since I'm pretty sure people will probably comment on it, while he is a specialist during Emperor time, Kurapika nonetheless maintains his conjurer affinity distribution, but can utilize the other categories to their fullest possible potency while in it, for a conjurer. Trying to explain and overanalyze EP would really be a video in its own right, so I'm not going to get into it now. But it really is goddamn weird. It's by far the most specialist thing out there. Second, I'm still deciding on it, but the title will probably be a bit clickbaity. Sorry about that, but it took me a while to make this, and I want to get as many eyes on it as I can. In any case, if you want, you can follow me on my channel socials, they'll be in the description. And as always, thank you for watching, feedback is always appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.